Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us from different parts of the globe to the European Research Days 2022 Australia and New Zealand. It is a flagship event of Euraxess Australia and New Zealand, organized in collaboration with the Delegation of European Union to Australia and the Delegation of European Union to New Zealand. Please join me in welcoming our honorable guests for today. We have with us EU Ambassador to Australia, His Excellency Mr. Gabriele Visentin. We are also joined by the EU Ambassador to New Zealand, Her Excellency Ms. Nina Obermeyer. Similarly, we have with us the Head of Unit for International Cooperation at the European Commission, Dr. Martin Penny. Later on, for the panel, we will have President of the European Research Council, Professor Maria Leptin, Foreign Secretary at the Australian Academy of Science, Professor Francis Separovich, President of the Royal Society of New Zealand, Dr. Brent Clothier, Executive Director for Engineering and Information Sciences at the Australian Research Council, Dr. Robert Moon, CEO of NHMRC, Professor Anne Kelso, and Counselor for Europe for Industry, Science and Resources at the Australian Mission to the EU, Ms. Sarah Brown. First of all, thank you very much for your availability. We are eager to hear from all of you. My name is Dishant Sandila, and I'm the Regional Coordinator for Euraxess Australia and New Zealand. For those who have joined our webinar for the first time, Euraxess is an initiative of the European Commission that addresses barriers to the mobility of researchers and seeks to enhance scientific collaboration between Europe and the rest of the world. We provide free information about European research, career opportunities, international collaboration, and networking possibilities. Since all of you are watching this on your laptop or on your phone, I'll encourage you to type Euraxess Australia and New Zealand on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, or YouTube, and follow us there. You might as well want to tweet about this event, so please feel free to use the handle #ERD2022. Moving on to today's session, just to give you the running order, we will begin with insights on EU-Australia and EU-New Zealand cooperation in research and innovation. This will be followed by a keynote on EU's global approach to cooperation in research and innovation. And the second half of our event will be a panel on Stronger Together, the importance of international scientific collaboration moving forward. I'd encourage all of you to please use the question function in the Zoom interface to ask any questions that you might have while our speakers are speaking. We'll come back to take your questions at the end of each intervention. Now, without further ado, please allow me to pass the platform to His Excellency Mr. Gabriele Visentin to deliver his welcoming remarks on EU-Australia cooperation in research and innovation. Over to you, His Excellency.
Thank you very much, Nishant, and hello to old friends, old pals, Martin, Nina, good to see you. So good evening and good morning to all of you, according to your time change. So good morning, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I am delighted to join you today to open the second European Research Days in Australia, as far as I am concerned, but in New Zealand as well, follow up by Nina. And I would like to thank especially the distinguished speakers from the European Research Council, the Australian Academy of Science, the Royal Society of New Zealand, the Australian Research Council and National Health and Medical Research Council, who here in Australia, who will be discussing the importance of international scientific collaboration later this evening. As I have recently taken up my post representing the European Union in Australia, it is a great pleasure for me to put our research engagement into the context of our overall EU-Australia relationship. The EU and Australia are like-minded partners on many levels. We might be geographically distant, but we are closely aligned on global and regional issues. As the world becomes more and more interconnected, we know it is not enough to just look after our own patch. We all need to work together to support and maintain the international rules-based order, which is under threat from many sides. And over the past 12 months, the relationship between the EU and Australia has grown both deeper and wider, and we now have the opportunity to do even more. The EU-Australia Framework Agreement has just formally entered into force on 21st October this year. And this agreement will strengthen the already substantial strategic cooperation between Australia, the EU, and the EU's member states. The EU and Australia are also in the process of negotiating a free trade agreement, which, when finalized, hopefully sometimes next year, will be the most comprehensive free trade agreement endorsed to date, following the clear example set by the EU-New Zealand free trade agreement. But tonight, we are here to talk about the importance of research, science, and innovation as individual and collective efforts. Australia and the EU have a long history of productive research collaboration. Australia was the first country with which the EU signed a treaty-level science and technology agreement, and that was back already in 1994. Some of you might have encountered the framework programs, or more recently, Horizon 2020 during your career. The EU's science programs are extraordinary in their scope and coverage, and make some of the largest public sector investments in science, research, and innovation in the world. The latest iteration is Horizon Europe, which will run from 2021 to 2027 and has an overall budget of 95.5 billion euros, which amounts to around 140 billion Australian dollars. And the EU would welcome deeper international collaboration between Australian and European scientists, researchers, and innovators. Having launched Horizon Europe in 2021, the EU expects international cooperation to intensify. The EU's global approach to research and innovation embraces Europe's commitment to a level of global openness that is needed to drive excellence and solutions to global challenges. You will hear much more about this over the next 4 hours. So I just want to remind you that Horizon Europe comes with a new opportunity for countries outside the EU to participate in the program. With their reputation for excellent research, Australian researchers will also benefit by leveraging their investments through involvement in the EU's program. It simply makes good sense to ensure that you are participating in science, research, and innovation activities funded through the framework programs. Association opens the door even further to the significant investments by Europe to advance knowledge and knowledge-based economies. Australia ranked 4th in terms of the number of researchers from countries participating in signed funding agreements during Horizon 2020. And with the help of Australia's most brilliant minds, we hope to further increase your participation, and we would welcome Australia's association to Horizon Europe. Australian researchers have taken part in nearly 400 projects since the start of Horizon 2020. Notably, Australia has its greatest number of participants in the Sklodowska-Curie actions, with 234 researchers participating under Horizon Europe. And there are already more than 40 researchers participating from organizations based in Australia who will benefit from European funding in Horizon Europe. The EU-Australia relationship in science and technology has been good, but we want it to be even better. Overall, Australia has more collaboration with the EU than any single country in the world, and the EU is Australian researchers' biggest publication partner. For some years, we have seen more than 30,000 co-publications annually. Under Australia's global innovation strategy, the EU and its member countries are priority economies for collaboration. And this can be expanded beyond just advanced manufacturing, AI and quantum, hydrogen, RNA research, and mRNA vaccine development. It can build upon the many areas of cooperation between Australia and the EU through the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, CSIRO, and other government-to-government research organizations. For instance, Australia plays a significant role in the International Radio Telescope Square Kilometre Array, hosts the European Space Agency's tracking station at New Norcia, and one of 3 deep space tracking stations around the world, just outside of Canberra. Australia is also a strategic partner of the European Southern Observatory, the ESO, and Australia is an associate member of European Molecular Biology Laboratories. International events like the COVID-19 pandemic have driven us to partner and work together like never before. And researchers from both continents step up to meet this global challenge. We need to widen and not to narrow our efforts in the future. The new opportunity to associate with Horizon Europe is for like-minded third countries like Australia, Canada, South Korea, and Japan to consider associating with the EU on the basis of their good capacity in science, technology, and innovation, commitment to a rules-based open market economy, including fair and equitable dealing with intellectual property rights, respect of human rights, backed by democratic institutions, and active promotion of policies to improve the economic and social well-being of citizens. The EU has also formulated mission-oriented approaches to convening research effort and solving the challenges we face. Missions use the Sustainable Development Goals as sources for their design and implementation, encourage broad engagement and active participation from various types of stakeholders from the public and private sector, including citizens and end users. Are bold and inspirational, hence have wide scientific, technological, societal, economic, environmental, or policy relevance and impact. The 5 EU missions will support adaptation to climate change, target cancer, focus on oceans, create 100 climate neutral and smart cities by 2030, and lead the transition towards healthy soils by 2030. In conclusion, I am confident that the coming years will see more exchanges and more joint projects on a range of issues, not least in the area of climate change and research and innovation that underpin solutions to global challenges. While we can both achieve a great deal by ourselves, we can do so much more together. I understand that my fellow panelist ambassador Nina Obermeyer will speak about the prospective negotiations for New Zealand association to Horizon Europe, which I hope may spark a little friendly competition between Australia and New Zealand to see who might associate first. And Dr. Martin Penny, dear Martin, will convince you all about the strategic intent embodied in the EU's global approach and the benefits of accessing European investments in science, research, and innovation offered by associating to Horizon Europe. So I thank you all for your kind attention, and I wish you all the best for the continuation of your conference today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, His Excellency. It was a very clear-cut and very concise way of beginning this European Research Day, a 5-day event that we have designed so that we could attract a lot of interest in terms of collaboration between researchers from Australia, New Zealand, and Europe. Thank you very much for your welcoming remarks and your availability for this event. To continue with the opening ceremony, I'd like to pass the platform to Her Excellency Ms. Nina Obermeyer to deliver her welcoming remarks on EU-New Zealand cooperation in research and innovation. Over to you, Nina.
Thank you very much, Nishant, and again, a big thank you also for organizing this impressive event with this lineup of eminent speakers. Thank you also for the invitation. And tēnei te mihi kia koutou katoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Very pleased to have this kōrero with you. And Gabriele has already preempted a lot of what I was going to talk about, not least the very close trans-Tasman friendship and rivalry. And I'm very pleased to say that we're one step ahead on 2 issues. And Gabriele has already mentioned that 2 issues that are very important and that I would like to elaborate a little bit on in these opening remarks that will contextualize our research cooperation in the wider context of reconnecting New Zealand and of strengthening relations between the EU and New Zealand. And these two issues are, of course, the free trade agreement that we have already concluded, and I think a bit more than 3 months ago, and the association negotiations that have been for Horizon Europe, that have been formally launched only a couple of days ago, and that are proceeding with great speed. But to zoom out a little bit, since I've now been here I've come to New Zealand almost exactly 3 years ago, and right before Commission President von der Leyen took office and announced the European Green Deal, with the objective of making Europe the first carbon neutral continent or climate neutral continent by 2050. And this is, of course, a leading theme for everything we're doing, and also for our research cooperation. This year is marked by New Zealand's reconnection with the world after the long lockdowns and the long time of Zoom diplomacy and even trade negotiations that took place virtually throughout the past years. And when we thought that global disruptions from the pandemic were coming to an end, we had the inestimable turmoil caused by the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine that only demonstrated more clearly how close the EU and New Zealand are, and made like-minded much more than a word, because New Zealand, within a matter of weeks, stood up its first autonomous sanctions in a strong gesture of solidarity with not only Ukraine, but also Europe and the global security order. So 2022, in spite of the war, has been a positive year for the European Union and New Zealand, and we've relished reconnecting with New Zealand and strengthening the bilateral partnership. And I've already mentioned the FTA, and I should maybe also mention our umbrella agreement, which is also fully entered into force a couple of months before the Australia Framework Agreement entered into force, notably in July. The EU-New Zealand Partnership Agreement that covers all policy areas where we are cooperating on entered into force in July and stimulated new opportunities such as trade. And on the 30th of June, we concluded the free trade agreement negotiations after 4 years of negotiations, which is, of course, an absolute highlight and a tremendous achievement in our bilateral relations. It creates significant new opportunities. Trade is expected to grow by 30%, and 91% of New Zealand's current goods trade to the EU will enter duty-free from day one. It's also a win for sustainability, to come back to the theme of the European Green Deal, as the FTA we've concluded with New Zealand is the first FTA where next generation, the gold standard of sustainability provisions have been agreed. The free trade agreement is also, in our view, and I think New Zealand very much shares this, a launch pad for closer cooperation in related areas, research and innovation, of course, being among them, but also more widely business cooperation. I already mentioned the sustainability provisions that are a gold standard in this agreement and a first for the European Union. There's another first in this free trade agreement, and that's our first indigenous chapter, a chapter on Māori trade and economic cooperation, which is integral to providing a platform for EU and Māori businesses to explore new opportunities. There are provisions across the free trade agreement that aim to benefit or promote and protect Māori rights and interests, such as in the areas of plant variety rights, services and investment, digital trade, and sustainable food systems. In the area of research, and this is something we're picking up here very much, because the relationship between the treaty partners is evolving at great pace, is becoming more and more important, and very pleased to say that this was acknowledged also in previous iterations of Horizon, in previous calls where New Zealand entities participated, and where Māori knowledge was acknowledged, or indigenous knowledge was acknowledged and used in the context of research projects. And I think it's important to note in this context the multi-year program, New Zealand's multi-year program on the future of research and development in New Zealand, Te Ara Pairangi, Future Pathways, which creates a lot more opportunities to build on research cooperation and to extend research cooperation between the New Zealand and the EU policy space, and where kaupapa Maori, so the purposes of Maori knowledge and the Maori worldview is explicitly acknowledged. But beyond the FTA and this New Zealand research strategy, there is a lot of reconnection, of course, happening in the context of our association negotiations. So the formal negotiations were launched mid-October as a result of the success of substantive informal talks earlier, which helped us to better understand each other. And this association, I think I can't possibly add anything to the very convincing pitch for association that Gabriele has made earlier. This will, of course, serve to expand our exchanges between EU and New Zealand education institutes. And this all based on the common thread of sustainability and climate action that is underlining the prospective association of New Zealand under the Horizon Europe program. It'll provide more opportunities to research and to tackle shared challenges and global issues with a particular focus on climate change. And we are very excited and are looking forward to work collaboratively on these shared, hard and existential issues that lie ahead. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Her Excellency Obermeier. It's always one of the highlights of the events that we organize to hear your insightful remarks and the ecosystem here in New Zealand. When I was in New Zealand for my mission, the roadshow that I organized, there was a lot of interest for Horizon Europe, which seems to be moving in the very right direction that we all desired. So thank you very much for your intervention as well. With that, I think from everybody thanking His Excellency Visentin and Her Excellency Nina Obermeier for being available and for delivering these welcome remarks. Now we will move on to our keynote address. We are very glad to have with us Dr. Martin Penny. Dr. Penny is the head of unit for international cooperation at the European Commission, and his address will focus on EU's global approach for cooperation in research and innovation. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Penny, so early in the morning from Brussels. Thank you for joining us. I'll start sharing my screen and you can take over your address.
Thank you very much, Nishant, and good morning to those of you in Brussels or in Europe, and good evening to those of you in Australia and New Zealand. So Nishant, if you go straight to the second slide, Nishant, the next slide. So my talk this morning, I hope will bridge the themes of this morning. We heard about the importance of EU-Australia and EU-New Zealand relations and cooperation. In the next session, we're talking about the importance of international cooperation in research and innovation. And part of these days, we'll also look at the opportunities which researchers in Australia and New Zealand have for teaming up with counterparts in Europe or for undertaking individual research projects through the European funding programs. And so I hope my talk will bridge all of that together, talking about the global approach to research innovation, which is our strategy for international cooperation and research innovation in a changing world. And I think this importance of being open to the world is very much a core element of the current College of Commissioners. You see here some quotes from Commissioner van der Leyen, President van der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, which sets out one of her key priorities, a stronger Europe in the world. with words which we strongly identify with in research and innovation: the need for multilateralism, the need for sustainable policies, our values of respect, and the need for respect of a level playing field. Next slide, Michelle. And with all of these aspects in mind, last year in May, the European Commission revisited and republished a new strategy for research and innovation. We called it the Global Approach to Research and Innovation. And I give you some elements of it here on this slide. It was actually the first time for about 10 years that the EU has revisited its international strategy. And I think it was important to do so. And here gives you an overview of 5 of the key elements of the strategy, which I'll go to in a little bit more detail. So Nishant, if you go to the next slide. So firstly, the need for openness in research and innovation, confirming what we all know, that the best ideas, the best minds can come from anywhere in the world. And it's by working together, bringing together the best minds, resources, research teams, research infrastructures, we can find the best and most timely solutions to the problems which we have in issues such as the green transitions which are needed, and the digital transitions in our health, in our economies, in our approaches to innovation. The European Union has always been very open in its research programs, and as you'll see later, our funding programs have been open to the participation of researchers from anywhere in the world. And this strategy confirmed the need for both our policy and our program to remain fully open to international cooperation. Secondly, recognizing the need for strengthening multilateral research and innovation partnerships to really deliver on major global problems, and really looking at how we can strengthen those which are existing and develop new ones. And here I'm talking about research partnerships which exist, for example, Mission Innovation for Clean Innovation, which Australia is involved with, the IPCC, which we're all involved with very timely with what's going on now in Egypt. Also looking at research consortia dealing with, multilateral consortia dealing with rare diseases, with personalized medicine, with animal health, with ocean research, and so on. So these are major initiatives which the global approach sets out the importance of, but also hopefully looks to prepare the ground for developing new ones. Next slide, please. But one of the things which is really different in the global approach is this fundamental focus on the need for a level playing field and reciprocity based around common values and principles. The EU said it needs to safeguard its openness. We need to make sure that our research cooperation with our international partners is based on these values and principles, and the fact that they're respected issues such as academic freedom, research ethics, gender equality, respect for IPR, open science, partnership with low and middle income countries, environmental and sustainable responsibility, and so on, as well as the respect of human rights. And this is one of the things, if we go on to the next slide, which forms a key part of our current actions. We've opened and launched a multilateral dialogue with most member states, the countries which are associated to the framework program, and I'll explain that term, which you've heard a little bit about already in one of my next slides, and also our major partners on these principles and values which are underpinning R&I cooperation. This builds on work which is done in many other fora, for example, in G7 and in G20, through the OECD, through the Global Research Council, through UNESCO, and through many sectoral bodies, and so on. But it really brings together a broad variety of countries looking at these values and principles and bringing them all together collectively. Often in these international dialogues, it's been focusing on one particular value and principle. But we have identified 10 of these which we think are necessary and need to have mutual respect for to ensure that international cooperation be carried out on a free and fair basis. And we were really delighted when we launched this dialogue in July. It was actually opened by Sir Peter Gluckman, the President of the International Science Council and former Chief Scientific Advisor to the New Zealand government, who stressed that these are not EU values by any means. These are the fundamental values by which scientists, the science system, and science itself works and needs to work. and ensuring that we have better understanding of what we mean and what we understand by these principles and values across countries will help all researchers work together in an international cooperation. So this is what we have put in place. It's an open dialogue. By that I mean that we may have more similarities than we appreciate. It could be that we call the same things by different terminologies. Give a specific example of research integrity, which in Australia and New Zealand, like in the EU, we mean in research integrity by ensuring that science is conducted well, there's no scientific misconduct. If we look at our colleagues across the Atlantic, when they talk about research integrity, they use it to refer more to research security and risk management. So this is the kind of things which we're putting in place. Then, based on our level of like-mindedness, we may wish to modulate our cooperation with certain third countries, take into account of the fact that we may or may not be working on a level playing field. A second part of this modulated cooperation is we may co-design initiatives to support low and middle income countries that want to upgrade their research innovation system. And the EU has a good history of doing so, particularly in the area of clinical trials with the Global Health Programme, also was previously known the clinical trials platform for developing countries. We go on to the next slide, please. All of this policy is put in place through Horizon Europe, and I'm not going to go through Horizon Europe in any great detail. You hear more about that in the next couple of days. But what I want to say is this was the policy. Those of you who are joining as researchers may say, well, what does this mean for me? And what it means for you, and I think if there's one take-home message that I'd like people to have from today, is there are opportunities for each and every one of you in this webinar today, be it an individual researcher, a PhD, postdoc, or junior researcher level, be it for more established researchers, excuse me, wanting to work in collaboration with European counterparts. If you're a researcher coming from a university, from a company, from a research center, or a research organization, there are opportunities for all of you. So in his introduction, Gabriele talked about the budget and the size and the length of Horizon Europe. I won't need to go through that again, but it is the world's largest funding program for research and innovation, with a budget of over 95 billion euros over 7 years. It's divided into 3 different pillars, and to give you a flavor of what's in each of them, I won't go into the detail. Pillar 1 has many opportunities for individual researchers, for example, for PhD students and postdocs through the Sklodowska-Curie actions, for individual researchers at different stages of their career, through the European Research Council, starting grantees if you're 2 to 7 years after your PhD, consolidated 7 to 12, advanced grants for everybody else. There are also other opportunities in both of these programs. And Research Infrastructures is a program to open up research infrastructures transnationally, to allow access to researchers from across the globe, and also to develop and kickstart the development of new research infrastructures. The bulk of the program is in Pillar 2, Global Challenges and European Industrial Competitive. And this is divided into, into these 6 clusters that you see here. This is where European researchers can team up with researchers from Australia and New Zealand in consortia. The requirement is that there are at least 3 member states or associated countries in each consortia, but in practice, they are much larger than that, bringing together 10 to 12, maybe more, partners from all across the world. The EU, as part of its openness, will fund researchers from low and middle income countries in exactly the same way as member states. Those from industrialized countries such as Australia and New Zealand participate, but participate on a self-funding basis. But I will come back to that again when we talk about association. Pillar 3 is really looking at innovation in Europe. And whilst it's open to the world, I would actually say that if you're looking for opportunities in Europe, in this webinar today, you're a researcher based in Australia and New Zealand, there are more opportunities for you to look at in Pillars 1 and Pillar 2 of the program. But I'm happy to take questions on Pillar 3 if people have them. So if I go to the next slide, please. I think it's important to say, well, what does this mean in terms of EU-Australia relations? Now, Gabriele mentioned this in his introduction, that yes, we have a very long history of cooperation with Australia. Australia was the very first partner country that the EU signed an international treaty-level science and technology cooperation agreement with in 1994. And it was actually many years afterwards, it was 1998, before we signed the second one. So our pedigree and interest in working with Australia goes back very many years. And Australia has always been in the top 5 of the international partners participating in our programs. As Gabriele said, 4th in Horizon 2020, currently 5th in Horizon Europe. And participating in many areas, you see particularly strong in, apologies for the acronym, the Marie Curie Sklodowska actions, the researcher mobility actions that I talked about before, but also in areas such as health, food economy, natural resources, agriculture and environment, and cooperation in clean innovation through this international multilateral alliance that I talked about through Mission Innovation. Now, many of you may be wondering, what on earth is this association that has been mentioned by me in the past and also by both Nina and by Gabriele in their opening remarks? Association is a way of effectively buying in to the European Research Programme. It is when a country says that our priorities and our principles and values which underpin how we conduct research are very similar to those of the European Union. And so much so that we would like to sign an international agreement to participate in the programme on an equal basis to member states. In the past, this has been done by countries very much in the European immediate neighbourhood. So countries such as Norway and Iceland, countries in the Western Balkans, and also countries around Europe's borders, both to the east and to the south. So, for example, Ukraine has been an associated partner country in Horizon 2020 and is again in Horizon Europe, similarly for Tunisia. But in Horizon Europe, the scope of association has changed, where we said if a country from outside of Europe, broader, anywhere else in the world, shares our values and principles, or shares the values and principles that we uphold, and would like to participate in the programme on an equal basis, then association is open to them as well. And so this offer is made to Australia. I know this is being actively considered by the new Australian government. And we look forward to seeing the outcomes of those discussions and potentially opening negotiations in the near future. We've already had very successful and informative technical talks to explain the concept of association to Australian counterparts. Next slide, please, Michelle. If we look at New Zealand relations in Horizon Europe and Horizon 2020, again, a Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement, this time dating from 2009. And these cooperation agreements provide a platform both for dialogue, but also ensuring that all of the issues which are necessary in research and innovation have been thought out in advance. So it makes our researchers easier, makes it easier for our researchers to participate when you're looking at issues such as, for example, IPR. Importantly, this is this platform for dialogue where we'll have every 2 years, although COVID has meant that we haven't met now for 3 years in both cases, a formal meeting where we discuss together our experience of working together and look for new potential areas of cooperation where our researchers can particularly work together. New Zealand has always been in the top 20 international partners participating in both Horizon Europe and Horizon 2020, and similarly to Australia, has main areas of cooperation in the Marie Curie Sklodowska-Curie actions, in the food economy, food, bioeconomy, natural resources, agriculture and environment, and also in health. As our ambassador in New Zealand pointed out, New Zealand is well in progress with the formal negotiations for our association status to Horizon Europe. We opened those negotiations just 2 weeks ago, after having had a series of very successful exploratory talks, and we're looking forward to hopefully concluding those within the near future. What this will mean is once the association is complete, New Zealand will participate on exactly the same terms and conditions and with the same rights and obligations as organisations based in an EU member state. And so we're very much looking forward to that. If you recall, when I was talking about Pillar 2, I talked about a minimum consortium partnership of 3 member states or associated countries, of which 1 must be a member state. So it would mean, for example, an eligible consortium in the future could be France, Germany, New Zealand, for example. And so it's really part of the core partnership for research and innovation. My next slide is something which those of you who are saying, Martin, this is all very interesting, but where do I get information on the funding? And I think it's always useful to put this up front. And it's a slide which I hope you will keep, because I hope that these days of these EU research days will inspire many of you to look for European funding. And we've tried to make this as simple for you as possible. There's one central entry point for all EU funding, not just research and innovation, but to make it easy, the link I've given here is the direct link to the research and innovation part of that. And that one site, that portal, provides you with information on the calls themselves, on all of the guidance, on the application forms itself, and even the formal submission software is all on this one single portal. From there, you can also get plenty of information on how you get help. And you know, in Australia and New Zealand, you have the national contact points. There's many sorts of advice and guidance. And Nishant and his colleagues and his team from Euraxess is also here to help you in making sure that you can apply to the framework program too. So this is a very key and important site. Next slide, please. So I think I've mentioned this already, so I can go through it very quickly. So that you're all aware, Horizon Europe is by default open to international participation. So in the whole of the program, with a few tiny exceptions where a few topics have been restricted for security reasons, but it's less than 2% of the topics which are called for proposals. They are open to partners from Australia and New Zealand. Entities from low and middle income countries are eligible funding in collaborative projects. And here particularly, we would like you to encourage that you think not just about working with your European counterparts, but also with your counterparts that you may have, for example, in countries in the Pacific, where we particularly like to have further involvement of all countries of the world in the framework program, bringing together particularly situated knowledge when it comes to issues such as climate change and ocean research, for example. And so really encourage you to bring in partners from those areas. Researchers and innovators of any nationalities can apply for grants. And so, as I've said already, really encourage all of you in the audience to think of applying for funding. Next slide, please. To make things simpler, for Australia and New Zealand currently, this situation will change for New Zealand in the future if and when the negotiation completes. But in the past, when Australia has participated, we have formally asked you to sign our grant agreement. Now, this has created sometimes some issues saying, well, hang on, why are we signing up to a list of long, complex requirements when the funding is actually coming from us? We listened to you and we changed the process for Horizon Europe to make it simpler. So when you're participating on a non-funding basis, which will be the case most of the time for Australia, is currently the case for New Zealand. When it comes to the conclusion of once the evaluation has been completed and the grant is signing up, is being put together, you formally don't sign the grant agreement. You just have a link with the project through either one of the partners that you may be associated most closely with or the consortium as a whole. And so your link is with the research rather than with the contract with the European Commission. And we think this makes it simpler for you to participate. I've just come back from a week in Washington, and I was really quite surprised how strongly supportive our American counterparts are of this new approach. Speaking to people at MIT who used to say, be very careful about participating in the EU framework programs because of the contractual conditions. They now actively, openly encourage all of their faculty to participate in the framework program because of this associated partner status. Next slide, please. So when you look at the current opportunities, just to whet your appetite, the 2021-2022 work program is about 3 billion euros of funding for international cooperation actions. These are topics where, in addition to the whole program being fully open, there are certain topics where we say, you can't really get a research answer which is excellent, or the impact of your project cannot be really fully fulfilled unless you bring in international partners. So there are about 200, about 1 in 5 of the topics in the work program where we specifically state that these, you can't do it really without an international partner. Some of these are targeting particular countries or regions when it's a particular research question which requires that. Some of them are targeting research actions which are already existing under multilateral initiatives. But in addition to this general openness, we have these targeted projects, about 1 in 5. You may be interested, from those of you who know our framework program cycles, we'll be launching, excuse me, and adopting the new work program for 23-24 towards the end of this month. And here the picture is actually even slightly higher. So it's 19.8% of the actions in the 21-22 work program were specifically targeted for international partner countries. It's about 23% in the 23-24 work program. So in addition to this general openness, there's an actually increased number of topics where we say you can't really do these without international partners. I'm just going to show on the next slide, I talked about some multilateral initiatives. I don't need to go through these, you know them well, I'm sure. You know, for example, the IPCC, the Mission Innovation on Clean Energy, where Australia is a member, the International Research Consortium on Animal Health, on infectious diseases research, on rare diseases, all of where Australia is a member. There are many others of these, and these are ones where we hope we can encourage the new such multilateral initiatives to be developed, and also broaden the geographic scope of the membership of many of them as well. So to my final slide. This is what I said, and it's again the message I want you to take home, that here there are opportunities for all of you, irrespective of who you are and where you come from. And just to the final slide, when you're looking for help, there's a lot of help out there. I've given you a link here to the Global Approach strategy, which I spoke about, the funding and tenders portal. But also, I think it'd be useful, you have already the contact links for Euraxess through the setup of this conference, and they can also be your guiding light to where you should direct yourself in terms of getting more advice, more guidance on the opportunities that are available to you. So I hope I've given you a flavour of why international cooperation is important, set out how we see this in terms of our strategy and policy, and I hope I encourage many of you to look for the opportunities for research and innovation funding opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Penny. That was an excellent way of summarizing the EU's global approach. I think we have lots and lots of questions in mind. I encourage all of you to type your questions in the Q&A function. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Penny, for that remark. I think we are pretty much on time with our schedule. I'm aware that you have other priorities and other commitments to address. So I am very thankful for from the entire ecosystem in Australia and New Zealand to have with us for this duration of almost 30 minutes that you managed to take out from your calendar. Thank you very much for joining us so early. I hope that in the near future, we will have closer collaboration with Australia and New Zealand, with the European Union. And I think with that, thank you very much for joining us. Moving on, it is my pleasure to welcome the next panel, and the moderator for the next panel, Ms. Sarah Brown, who is the Counselor for Industry, Science and Resources at the Australian Embassy to Belgium, Luxembourg, and Mission to the EU and NATO. Sarah, I will pass it over to you to discuss the panel on Stronger Together, the Importance of International Scientific Collaboration. And please feel free to moderate it as you feel relevant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nishant, and also my thanks to our speakers before now, both of their excellencies and Dr. Penny. I think they've framed the conversation we're about to have now very well in terms of, the very strong relationship between Australia and New Zealand and the EU, and the importance of international collaboration, which is, of course, our title of our next panel, Stronger Together, the Importance of International Science Collaboration Moving Forward. So I'd like to introduce our panellists for this session. So thank you very much for joining us. So we have Professor Maria Lepton, the President of the European Research Council. We have Professor Francis I knew I was going to do this. Separovic. Close enough? Good. Foreign Secretary of the Australian Academy of Science. Dr. Brent Clothier, President of the Royal Society of New Zealand. Dr. Robert Munn, Executive Director, Engineering and Information Sciences at the Australian Research Council. And finally, Professor Anne Kelso, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Health and Medical Research Council. So as our previous speakers outlined, of course, international collaboration is something we all value. It's something that we need to address shared challenges, but there are challenges to international collaboration at the moment. The international geopolitical environment is causing people to reflect. And of course, there is a focus on domestic economic strength as we come out of COVID, as we experience all of the economic shocks that are happening at the moment through the energy crisis. And these things are, they do create challenges for international collaboration and what we want to do going forward. So I think that's the kind of framing for the conversation we want to have today. But first, I really want to ask everyone to kind of give me their 5 minutes of their views about this topic and what's happening. So I'll start with Professor Lepton, if that's okay, if you could give me your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much. I should warn you, I've been having terrible problems with my Wi-Fi. So if I stop, maybe you just then pass on to the next person and I return later. I don't know how to fix it. Anyway, right now, I hope you can hear me. And good morning, colleagues here in Europe, and good evening, colleagues over there on the other side of the planet. And in fact, speaking of the planet, we have today the COP27 going on in Sharm el-Sheikh. Also, we're only just emerging, hopefully, from a major pandemic. And so in the face of climate change and COVID, can anyone in their right mind even ask about the value, forget it, the absolute need for international collaboration in research? You know that international collaboration in research has helped during the pandemic, was in fact amazingly effective, and the scientific community reacted with admirable mechanisms for dealing with the crisis. And obviously in climate change, it's essential that we work together. So I could simply end my introductory statement right there and say, what sort of a question is this? Still, you could say that's all rhetoric, and these are very special cases. And let's hope, let's just also hope that we won't be seeing any more of those. What about normal research? Well, I can give you examples about these too. One very pragmatic. If we look at the nations that are successful in the ERC, that are most successful in the ERC at attracting grants, it happens to be those who have the most foreigners in their country, most foreign researchers: UK, Switzerland, Netherlands, to some extent Germany. If you even look more, then you can say, well, those are ones that pay high wages or whatever, and it doesn't matter that more foreigners are there or they speak English. That also helps. But if you look more closely then at the applicants from those countries and ask, what is the proportion of foreigners that are successful among those applicants from those countries? It's again the foreigners. So the foreigners in those countries do better than their national colleagues. So that's, of course, could just be mobility, but to me, it says more than that. And there's also data that show that researchers who've been mobile early in their career, i.e. who've gone to do their PhD or their postdoc abroad and who've returned to their own country they're more successful in obtaining jobs and obtaining grants, in publishing high-level papers, etc. So what's so good about mobility? I mean, there's two things. There's the one that we all know. It opens your mind to ways things are done elsewhere in the world. It broadens your spectrum of approaches, but it also gives you a network of colleagues abroad. And all of these are of intrinsic value. So scientific ideas may be born in, some scientific ideas may be born in ivory towers, but their further development, and of course, above all, their critical assessment, depends entirely on such networks. Their sharing, you know, and then coming out of that, the further development and your own sort of fertilization through thoughts of others. So the value of your own ideas are actually multiplied by interactions, and the broader the network, the better. So I think it's good for individual careers, but it's also good for science and research as a whole. So I could, the ERC, Martin has already mentioned some of the tools that are in place. The ERC has adopted a number of measures that help researchers connect, and in particular to help researchers outside Europe to participate in ERC calls. So for instance, for researchers who decide to move to Europe, there's an additional up to 1 million euros that they can claim to set up their labs. So it's a startup money. Dual affiliation is possible for researchers who want to keep a foot in their home country. So international team members can reside, so they can, as long as they spend at least 50% of their time in Europe. International team members, if you have a team, but you need expertise from outside, it's not just within the synergy grants, but also in individual researcher grants. International team members can reside outside Europe. And then, of course, Martin has already mentioned the synergy scheme, which is really wonderful for bringing researchers together because it specifically focuses on collaboration to develop ideas that depend on the interaction. There are also exchange schemes where young researchers, mainly young researchers, but it's not restricted, from identified countries can spend time in labs of ERC grantees in Europe to learn techniques, to develop collaborations, etc. And the ERC has established two such schemes with Australian institutions, namely with the National Health and Medical Research Council and the Australian Research Council. So, of course, among the many researchers who hold ERC grants, there are Australians and New Zealanders, but I think I won't go through those numbers, but leave it there and leave the rest for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, now I'll move on to Frances now. What's your kind of 5 minutes of reflection on this topic?
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel and discussion. So since the establishment of the Australian Academy of Science in 1954, international scientific engagement has been a key area of the Academy focus and activity. The Academy's international programs aim to contribute Australian expertise and leadership in regional and global science networks and facilitate Australia's access to global science and technology and promote strategic partnerships between Australian and overseas researchers. I've been the Australian Academy of Sciences Foreign Secretary since May this year. In this role, I undertake to advance the Academy's international engagement as a lead in the International Science Academy network. We do this in several ways. Firstly, by assisting the Australian government to deliver its international science activities and advocating for a strategic and comprehensive international science engagement program. Examples of international programs administered by the Academy on behalf of the Australian government include supporting Australian researchers to undertake research projects in the Asia Pacific through the government's Regional Collaborations Program, a series of annual symposia between Australia and China funded through the Australian government's Australia China Science and Research Fund, and fellowships that support young researchers from Australia to travel to India under the Australian government's Australian-India Strategic Research Fund. Secondly, the Academy is also Australia's member to the International Science Council and a number of international scientific unions. As a member to these international bodies, the Academy has a responsibility to promote international scientific engagement by maintaining relationships between Australian scientists, the international scientific unions, and the International Science Council and other international groups. The Academy nominates many Australian scientists to these international bodies. For example, Professor Cheryl Praeger, former Foreign Secretary of the Academy, has chaired the Special Committee for Women in Science and Engineering of the Association of Sciences Asia. Academy Fellow, Professor Nalini Josh Union. Dr. Helen Clue is Vice Chair of the Joint Scientific Committee of the World Climate Research Programme, and I was recently elected to the Advisory Committee of the Inter-Academy Partnership, and I'm President-elect of Division 1 of the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry. These are just a few examples, but they highlight the leading role of Australian women in our international scientific engagement. Finally, the Academy provides science leadership in Southeast Asia. Our leadership in the region was highlighted recently by an Australian government $10.3 million investment. This investment over a period of 6 years will establish the International Science Council Asia Pacific regional presence at the Australian Academy of Science. The investment enables Australia to leverage its standing as a science and research leader and engage in strategic science diplomacy in our region and globally. We expect to achieve better opportunities for Australian scientists to work with and benefit from international collaborations and stronger focus on science in our region. The pan-national research effort in response to the COVID-19 challenge demonstrates the power of science, to which international collaboration is indispensable. This pandemic has seen an unmatched level of international scientific cooperation and goodwill to combat the impact of the virus on the world, including international groups that worked rapidly to find a vaccine. Through our work investigating the impacts of COVID-19 on women in STEM in the Asia-Pacific region, we were able to uncover solutions and offer ways the STEM system could work together to overcome barriers to achieving gender equity. Maintaining support for international research collaborations, both through the pandemic and in post-pandemic recovery, is essential for scientific advancement and human and environmental well-being. The pandemic has taught us to adapt the way scientists across borders exchange ideas and how they engage in productive scientific progress. The move to virtual conferences helped to improve equity and diversity in science by removing barriers to participation at the same time as reducing the carbon footprint of those attending. These interactions, the majority of which have been virtual, create shared interests and provide a basis for diplomatic engagement. Now that borders are opening again, it will be important for many of us to reconnect in person with colleagues and organisations overseas. But we should also ensure that we build on the experiences of the past 2 years and continue to develop new and sustainable ways of working internationally. Just this morning, I returned from the Inter-Academy Partnership Triennial Conference and General Assembly, held together with the worldwide meeting of young academies in Arizona. This was a hybrid meeting, and I was able to experience firsthand the benefits of meeting in person and the wider access provided by virtual participation. I'd like to end by stating that engaging in international scientific cooperation contributes towards Australia's harmonious international relations and builds strategic partnerships that benefit all partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frances. So now we'll move on to Brent.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Brent Clothier tōku ingoa. I'm president of the Royal Society Te Aparangi in New Zealand. The Royal Society of New Zealand is a somewhat unusual academy. We're 167 years old. We're a single academy. Our academy involves the sciences, engineering, social sciences and humanities. So we're a single body in that regard. We also, as an institute, actually on behalf of the government, are a purchase agent for research and development. So we have those dual roles of an academy, connection with constituent organisations, members, branches, and a purchase agent on behalf of the government. In terms of our engagement internationally, of course, we connect with the International Science Council. Of course, there is a Kiwi, Sir Peter Gluckman, who heads that, and we have regular contact with Sir Peter, not surprisingly. And that provides a collective voice for researchers globally, especially in these troubled times around researchers under threat and other global issues. In terms of how we work for the government, we are the conduit to the international unions. We also provide research funding for overseas work through our Catalyst funds for overseas development for Kiwis to travel overseas and vice versa. And also we work on behalf of the government for ORCID registration. On our own, we have initiatives around Tuia 250. I'm trying to think of a synonym for celebration, because the remembrance of Captain James Cook visiting New Zealand and how we connected between the academies in the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom government and the tangata whenua, the indigenous population. We also connect through our sort of colonial heritage with academies in the United Kingdom, Scotland, Canada, Australia, and Ireland, and in particular initiatives developing around Indigenous knowledge systems and the recognition of excellence and impact in Indigenous knowledge systems. The second bullet point relates to the pandemic. Of course, it's been challenging for all of us, and we're getting used to these kind of meetings through Zoom meetings, and so now we're starting that face-to-face. And see, Francis has come back from Arizona. I've just come back on Sunday from the Emirates, where we've been able to reconnect face-to-face. But it's been a tough time. In particular, it's been a tough time for our postdocs and early and mid-career researchers. And I might also add that, especially for a small country at the bottom of the world, to have those international connections. But look, here's a sense of optimism that I feel, as sort of Francis has alluded to in my own travels, and also what Nina has mentioned. I think we're re-emerging post-pandemic into a world where we realise the incredible value of networks and the incredible value of face-to-face contact. And so I think coming out of, God willing, in a tailwind, a pandemic, we'll see added impetus around our connections and networks. And I see what this Euraxess is actually going to provide. I would just like to conclude with something that Nina mentioned, that in New Zealand, our Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment is undergoing Te Ara Pairangi, the future pathways. Where do we want to go with our innovation RS&I, research innovation system? They're considering what is excellence, what is impact, how do we manage our workforce, how do we manage in particular our EMCRs, what are our national science priorities, how do we handle infrastructure, and in particular a huge effort around Indigenous knowledge systems and the recognition of excellence and impact from Indigenous knowledge systems. And another impetus there is around Indigenous researchers, our Maori, our Pacifica researchers. How do we integrate them into the system so we have a voice from them? So that's a message I would bring to you from the Royal Society of New Zealand, Te Ara Pairangi. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou, katoa.
Thank you very much, Brent. And yes, it's certainly a time for reflection in many countries, and I know that's the same in Australia, with our Minister for Science announcing a refresh and a consideration of our national science and research priorities and our national science statement. You know, considerable work happening on a university accord, etc. So, you know, it's certainly a time for reflection, I think. So
Sarah,
I think
could I just add one more thing? Just add one more thing. I visited with Paul Atkins, our Chief Chief Executive, and one of the highlights of our visit to Australia recently to meet with the academies there was to meet with the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Studies, and that's a huge highlight. And I see a marvellous connection that we can make there, and it's something also we're trying to work with our Canadian colleagues, where the Indigenous knowledge system of First Nations peoples, in plural, as it is in Australia, is something that's hugely important for our respective nations and others.
Agree completely, and I think that will also be a strong focus for Australia in moving forward, you know, with the work happening in Australia in terms of a voice to Parliament, and more generally, you know, the First Nations knowledge systems, and I think that's a great thing. So I'll move on to my Australian colleagues now. So Robert, your presentation. Thank you.
Nope, you successfully managed to mute yourself, Sarah.
So Robert, if you want to move on to your presentation, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sarah. Okay, the Australian Research Council, which I'll refer to by its common acronym of ARC, sees itself as playing an important role in supporting international collaboration by maintaining a presence within the community, but more importantly, providing funding opportunities that seek to bring together Australian and international researchers and organisations. We don't enter into country-specific agreements, but what we do seek to do is create and enhance the international collaboration by providing flexible opportunities for international engagement under our National Competitive Grants Program. Our funding is awarded on a competitive basis looking for excellence, and we don't give priority to or preference to projects that have collaboration with a specific country or other priority economies. What we do have, however, in all of our schemes and our fellowships are open to any overseas candidate, provided that they apply through an eligible Australian organisation, so one of our universities. If the overseas candidate is successful, then depending upon the role that they have, they may be required to reside in Australia for the majority of the project. The ARC is of the view that by encouraging mobility and collaborative relationships across international borders, all countries will improve their ability to respond to changing and increasingly globalised research landscapes. Researchers overseas may participate in our ARC-funded projects as partner investigators without any residency requirements whatsoever, which is another way we encourage the engagement. And the project funding itself can be requested to support the costs of international travel by any participant, the chief investigators, the fellows, awardees and partner investigators associated with the project to again strengthen and establish those collaborations between researchers and overseas. Organisations based overseas, including universities, companies and not-for-profit and government organisations, can participate either directly as a partner organisation with people participating or as other organisations that's associated with our projects. So from our perspective, that's the way we support the ongoing engagement with it. The second dot point was what were the challenges created by the pandemic, and for international collaboration for Australia and for us, the biggest one was the closed borders. That created significant challenges initially for us across the board. And for our active and recently granted applications, one of the quick things we arranged for and adjusted our funding was to allow our funding to be used by universities and projects to employ people overseas where they needed people overseas to do field work or experimental work rather than the individual researchers travelling over there. So we gave them the opportunity to enhance their collaboration through mechanisms like that. And equally, additionally, once the borders started to become open for at least limited travel, we assisted the universities in attempting to gain visa applications to bring people into the country to improve that element. But those were probably the biggest impacts that we were directly associated with, noting that we also recognised our applicants had an awful lot of impacts on them. So we, again, especially for early and mid-career researchers, extended application times that they were eligible for the early and mid-career grant schemes and so forth. and were very flexible at providing extensions to closing dates if people were ill or otherwise impacted by the pandemic, directly or indirectly, which we thought was particularly important. But one of the biggest positives, I suppose, that came from the activity itself was the recognition that we could operate most of our processes virtually rather than face-to-face, which significantly enhanced participation, especially in our selection committees of a lot of our senior assessors, by them being able to not have to relocate from where their home location was to where we were running the meeting itself, but participate more broadly from anywhere in the country and even anywhere in the planet. For several that were trapped in the UK and other places, they still continued to be able to work with us very closely and provide their assessments. So it's changed the way we've been thinking about how we're operating. And even going forward, one of the key challenges we've always had is perceptions of transparency, perhaps, of our processes. We have observer programs, but perhaps we've decided a newer way of running these ones is we can run our meetings nearly anywhere now. So we can have participations and observers from all over the country much more easily. So there are some positives that came out of the activities to go with the challenges that we had to overcome as a collective. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Robert. And finally, Anne, if I can ask you to round out this section of the panel.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah, and hi everyone. It's great to see you. So I'm speaking on behalf of the National Health and Medical Research Council. We're Australia's leading, it's the lead and largest funder of health and medical research here. So really the complement to the ARC, which funds non-medical research in Australia. Now, we've had a long interest in supporting Australian health and medical researchers to collaborate internationally. And I think in this session and in the talks before, we've heard why that's important, so I don't need to reiterate that. I also think we don't need to tell Australian researchers to collaborate either, because they're very good at it. And I think most researchers understand how much power this brings to their own activities, how much they have to contribute and how much they have to learn from those interactions. So we see that as very positive, and we see probably more international collaboration as we see in publications, for example, than we would see from our grant data, because these relationships are so deep and strong. But if we just look at our grant data, then we see over the last 10 years that NHMRC has awarded more than 1,400 grants that had at least one international collaborator. And that's added up to about $1.3 billion Australian dollars in investment. And it reflects mostly a couple of things. So we support international collaborations in several ways. And I think the one that's dominant really is what happens through our standard support schemes, which in a way is most similar to what Robert has just said about the ARC. So first of all, we allow international researchers and institutions to be named participants on any of our grants. We allow funds to be expended overseas if the work can't be done in Australia. So that means in a collaboration, there may be some of the funding spent in Australia, but some of it spent overseas, but managed through the Australian institution rather than NHMRC sending the funds overseas. We allow early career researchers who receive an emerging leadership fellowship to spend up to half of their 5-year grant duration in an overseas institution. And for our more senior researchers who receive leadership fellowships, they can spend up to 20% of their 5-year grant duration overseas. So again, that allows exchange even for people who are predominantly funded and working within Australia. So that's what we do through our standard schemes, and that's responsible really for most of NHMRC's support for international collaboration. But we also have a number of bilateral and multilateral alliances with other funders, and these are obviously very specifically designed to support collaborative research with international partners. It's a small part of our budget overall, but we find it's a really important and valuable way to focus attention for Australian researchers on specific collaborative opportunities. And of course, then there's a mutual leveraging of funds between the funders. So we have bilateral arrangements with a number of different funders, and notably with the EU, as well as with UKRI and the National Institute of Health Research and Care in the UK. We have multilateral alliances that we're part of, and the three big examples of that are the Global Alliance for Chronic Diseases, which the European Commission is a member of, as we are. Human Frontier Science Program, which appeared briefly on one of Martin's slides as one of the organisations affiliated, and also eAsia. So that's less relevant to Europe, but it's another multilateral alliance that we are part of, and we run joint research funding programs with. So overall, we've had about 72 countries which have been named as participants in NHMRC grants over the last 10 years. Now, the top five are the US, the UK, Canada, Germany, and New Zealand. The Netherlands and Italy have also well up on the list, particularly for the deliberate international collaborative schemes that we're part of. So I just want to very briefly mention the three collaborative schemes that are relevant for Europe. And the first is our partnership with EU, which we call NHMRC EU Collaborative Research Grant Scheme. And this is enabling, it's providing some additional funding to Australian researchers who are part of successful Horizon Europe applications as part of international collaborative consortia in a number of topics that NHMRC will have chosen as being relevant to Australia in particular. We're participating in those collaborative grants in just about every year in the last 10 years. It's been about 25% of our international collaborative scheme funding over that time, about 23 million Australian dollars. So that's something we offer regularly and has been very well taken up by the sector over the years. And on most years, we'd be contributing to up to 8 successful applications in that way. The second one is the EU Joint Programme for Neurodegenerative Disease, JPND, and Australia has been, through NHMRC, has been partnering by providing funding for the Australian-based components of research where there's a transnational consortium that's been recommended for funding by JPND. So in both that EU1 and JPND, the peer review is done by the other funder, by the European funder, and we are simply providing some additional resources to enable Australian participation in those successful consortia. The final one I wanted to just say a little bit more about is Human Frontier Science Program. It differs from the others in, first of all, it's a truly international organisation. And for those who are familiar with it, you know, it's really exceptional because of the way it supports high risk, high reward research that's right at the frontiers of life science. Very exciting program, not particularly high budget program, but really outstanding research is funded through Human Frontier Science Program. Australia has been a member through NHMRC, our funder, our agency, for a long time. We contribute funding every year into the pot of money that the Human Frontier Science Program then distributes. And there have been some really terrific Australian researchers who've been funded through HFSP or are currently funded through that agency. So for Australian researchers, and in fact New Zealand researchers as well, if you're interested in that funder, it's very well worth looking and seeing whether it's appropriate for you. I think collectively we look overall at all of our investment in collaborations. We see that European collaborations are greater than with any other region of the world, and I can imagine that that will continue. As I said, Australian researchers don't need to be encouraged to collaborate, but I think as a funder we can try to make it easier and help people to build on the connections that they already have. I think those connections are very strong between Australia and Europe for a lot of reasons. Of course, there are historical ties, there are cultural links. Many people in Australia have family ties in Europe, and so I think we'll go on having those strong cultural links for a long time to come, and they're a wonderful foundation for the research that we can all do together. So Sarah, those were the remarks I wanted to make to start off.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. So I really appreciate everyone's presentations, and I think it's clear that all of these organisations are really committed to international collaboration and really see the benefits. I think, you know, some of the things we perhaps had in our kind of second round of questions, I think we've really covered well in the initial presentations. So I might just move on to, you know, kind of the elephant in the room in a lot of ways in terms of that pressure around domestic benefit, around issues around securitization of research, you know, concerns about, you know, IP loss, things like that. You know, are you seeing these pressures in your countries and in your organisations? And, you know, how is that impacting your approach to international collaboration? I see it a bit in some conversations that were happening at the OECD last week, the Committees on Science and Technology Policy, you know, but still, of course, we all do need to work together in terms of international collaboration. So how can we keep what's good and not and demonstrate the benefit of international collaboration perhaps to our political masters? So I might start with Maria, if that's okay.
Yes, though about the European stance on this, I might defer to Martin. Of course, there's always some fear in disclosing your greatest discoveries. I can cite from my own graduate students and postdocs when they would go to conferences and ask, well, can I talk about these new results we've got? Isn't somebody going to steal them? And I have to say, during my career in research, I've had 3 cases where people, you know, scooped me and unethically used my knowledge to enhance their papers without letting me know. It's very, very rare. And so I always tell my students, you know, go out and talk. You get more back than you give on the whole. Of course, you have to learn whom to trust. And I think the same applies for nations. You know, if we close ourselves down, we're just going to cut off our nose to spite our face. So, however, you have to know whom to trust. And if nations close their giving off and insist only on taking, then I would say we'd better be careful a bit. Otherwise, the value of exchange is greater than the potential loss. And of course, when it comes to IP, you know, there are things where you know that it has commercial value, it can be applied. You patent it first. And countries that believe they can operate by only stealing from others, they can't. We know that. It's no coincidence that industry goes where the knowledge is created, and doesn't sort of just pick up bits and pieces here. There has to be an intense, trustful cooperation for that to work. So I say the same to nations as I say to my students. Just go for it, but be wary of those who you know will only exploit.
Thank you so much, Maria. So I don't know, Martin, did you want to jump in there based on her request, or should I move on to Brent?
I don't really have much more to add to what Maria said, so happy for you to move on to Brent.
Thanks so much, Martin. Brent.
Kia ora. Look, this is not a Royal Society Taparangi view, but in my day job, I'm president of the Royal Society Taparangi, but in my day job, I work for a government-owned research company. So this research company actually has 2/3 of its revenue come from commercial sources. So what Maria is saying is quite interesting for us in terms of how we employ our knowledge for our own good and for the greater good as well. I would add 2 things that, in terms of the work that we're doing in developing nations. A lot of that is through public-private partnerships, and I think this is quite an effective way of connecting the science from our systems with that in developing nations, and I think we can adequately protect and empower the research knowledge that comes from our developed nations research for developing nations. I'd just like to add something else, and I have another role as an editor-in-chief on an Elsevier journal now. Elsevier are a commercial company, And the move to open access publication is something that is quite interesting in this regard. And there is a far stronger move to open access publication across the suite of journals. The journal that I'm an editor-in-chief on will be flipped on 1st of January to open access. So that creates opportunities and challenges for how we publish our science. So that's another interesting aspect, how we move forward in this area around IP. I think the world needs the implementation of the IP that we are developing. And so how we balance those commercial imperatives with the greater good is a real challenge. So I leave with a question rather than an answer.
Thank you so much, Brent. Yes, indeed, a real challenge. So Frances, I see you've got your hand raised.
Yes, we're seeing greater scrutiny of international collaboration. And I would like Robert to comment. For example, in 2017, I think China was in the top 3 for international collaboration in the ARC, and now they've dropped out of the top 10. And we're also seeing things like the Foreign Influence Transparency Act, the University's Foreign Interference Task Force, and some vetoes of ARC grants as well. So sorry, Robert, to put you on the spot, but I'd be interested to hear.
Robert, been put on the spot, I'm afraid. How do you respond to Frances? I guess because it is, as I was saying, there's a pressure in terms of these things, and how are you seeing it play out at the ARC?
It's an interesting question and an interesting point. We do have what we call our countering foreign interference requirements, so information collection, but that's mainly focused around where research our participants are getting the other sources of funding from, as well as us. I wasn't aware that the change in the relative ranking of China was that dramatic, but I am aware that it has changed. A lot of that has been because traditionally our engagement with China has been their researchers coming to us and ours going to theirs. So it's probably dropped off significantly in the last couple of rounds, where I have certainly noticed a significantly lower requests for funding for international travel in the last round or two of ARC funding compared to when I first joined back in 2018. So that's possibly a significant element too there, that the inability to spend time in their facilities has changed the relative participation and occurrences there. From a pragmatic perspective, I think from our perspective, we recognise that the strength is the movement of the people. The bulk of the research capability is people mobility and everything else. And if you look at it, the average Australian selection advisory committees that I sit on, the great majority of the participants are not actually Australian born. They've come here potentially often as a postdoc and then stayed. And I think that's the great strength of the systems that Anne and the ARC support, because we do strongly encourage that mobility, especially for students and postdocs, and then continuing on it with our fellows. I see it more of a direction of where people want to go, rather than necessarily any direction by us, would be the answer that I would give.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robert. And so before I go back to Maria, because I see you've raised your hand, Anne, did you want to reflect on this issue at all, in terms of, the ideas of, the need for domestic benefit and how we continue to prosecute the importance of international collaboration?
Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah. And I agree completely with Maria about the importance of collaboration. And that's really, we want to foster that regardless of with whom and where, but also that question of trust. You do need to know who you're collaborating with, and whether you look at that through the filter of protecting your scoop or protecting your IP or protecting national interests. It is very important to know who you're collaborating with, And I think, like the ARC, we've now requiring that our part of our funding agreement is that institutions and therefore researchers should be aware of government regulations and guidelines on engagement with foreign entities and understand who you're working with. So that's a sort of interesting overlay of security concerns, national security concerns overlaid on the desirability of having widespread international engagement in our research and as open as possible an engagement as we can have. So, but it's true that the security concerns, and I think this is what Francis was particularly referring to, is a new overlay that's become prominent in Australia just in the last few years. It was interesting, the question of collaborations with China. I don't think we are aware or have data yet that show whether there's a significant drop in collaborations with China or with any other particular country. We continue to have strong collaborations with many countries of the world, but it may well be that there'll be shifts in the balance of those collaborative links over time as a result of all sorts of global events. That's part of an answer, Sarah. It's not everything that you were raising, I think.
All good. Thank you very much, Anne. Maria.
Yeah, I just wanted to, in case this got forgotten or in case I came across as callous, I don't think I did. I didn't mean to. I used the word exploitation, and we're talking about IPs. We seem to be talking about, leading scientific nations that compete with each other. One international interaction concerns, of course, an issue we've heard about here, and that is Indigenous knowledge. And there we're talking about nations with unequal strength. And they have, of course, been, some nations, some weaker nations with Indigenous knowledge have, of course, been exploited by the more advanced nations. And there, if we're looking at unequal strength, like anywhere in society, it's the duty of the stronger to protect the weaker. And I'm very glad to see that some nations actually protect themselves. But I think that's something we have to keep in mind, just because we are all here speaking from nations with a very advanced scientific infrastructure that we too can't just exploit.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. And I think a lot of the conversations about talent attraction and things like that, there's of course a lot of conversations at the European level about challenges with the sections of the EU not being able to retain their talent within the EU itself, and of course, with our relationship with developing nations, whether or not, we're building up their system or we're taking advantage a bit too much is, again, a very challenging conversation. Brent, you had your hand raised.
Yeah. Kia ora, thank you. Look, I have an interesting commentary in terms of what Robert and Anne and Maria have mentioned around the role of China. And we're talking about international connections, and so I'd like to reference China in terms of international connectedness. I would also preface that with the fact that the Royal Society Tāparangi, also on behalf of the government, is involved in scientific publication. But in my role in my day job with the Crown Research Institute, I am an editor-in-chief on an Elsevier journal, as I did mention. And it's interesting to just pass on a perspective. I've been quite a long-standing editor-in-chief. And so since around 2000, the submission of Chinese papers to our journal was around 10%, and the rejection rate was about 80%. Currently, we're receiving about 60% of our publications from China, and the quality has been absolutely transformational. Our impact factor as a journal has trebled, and you connect those dots. It's a journal on water, and so you connect those dots, and you can see that the rise in the submission from China and through the international connection the Chinese have had in that has resulted in our journal's impact factor trebling. So it's quite an interesting point in terms of where China fits. And of course, China, I think maybe Robert alluded to this in terms of the drop because of their zero COVID policy, the connections with China now are presently quite difficult in terms of ease of transaction. So how that pans out, I do not know, but I certainly know that in terms of in my area of research, it is an amazing area where the quantity and the quality of research through central government investment in China has been huge. Of course, that's water, which is a critical issue for them and for the world, may I add.
Yes, and of course that brings us back to the kind of shared global challenges and the need for international collaboration. So I'll now move on to some of the questions from the audience. So one I think I'll answer straight away is, why do you think Australia hasn't moved as swiftly as compared to New Zealand in getting associated to Horizon Europe? And I'm deeply involved in these conversations along with Martin. And so I think the key thing there is actually electoral cycles. Your usual issue of when an election was held. And we have a new minister. There is a new process to look at the revitalisation of the science statement, which will, of course, include international collaboration. So it's just one of those things where, new governments need to have time in place to consider these things. And so that's where we're at in terms of the process. Just following on from that, there was a question to Robert in terms of the ARC and whether it would consider having a co-fund like the exists in terms of NHMRC. So I'll just pass to you there, Robert.
Well, the short answer is we never say no to anything, because we always watch what NHMRC is up to with interest to see what works or what doesn't work, so we can replicate. And I'm sure they do the same to us as we learn from each other. But in the short term, no, we don't have any current intention for that one. Our current focus is on all the various different reviews we've got going on, so we can primarily focus on streamlining what we're currently managing rather than potentially starting up yet another stream.
Understood. So one of the other big questions is what advice do you have for an early mid-career researcher like myself who was a questioner, Roger, who was very interested in international collaboration but doesn't know where to start? So, from the venerable people we have on the panel, what do you think? What should they be doing? Anyone want to put up their hand to respond to that one?
Networking.
Maria. Sorry, Maria, you're still on mute.
Exactly. So networking, Francis just said, yeah, sure. So I think it has to be driven by your research, and you know your research best. And so you know where there's international expertise, or at least you should know, in your field that would benefit your research. For the networking, if there are young people out there among the participants, let me say this. Again, I'll report from a recent event where I was asked by, I think it was by an association of young researchers to give a talk there. And after the talk, someone came up to me and said, look, Mrs. ERC President, I put in an application recently and it didn't get it. What can you do to help me and, give me advice? So I gave that person advice, but then it was not very interesting for me. What can I advise? But then 5 minutes later, another person came up to me and said, look, Professor Lepton, what you said in your talk, I completely disagree with that. I see it this way. And we had an amazing discussion. That's good. So networking, like anything in research, doesn't mean taking, it means giving. If you're an interesting person to your counterparts, they like engaging. So yes, networking, but it has to come from your interests. You have to be interesting to the other person. And interesting scientists are interesting to their colleagues. So it has to be driven by your own research. You know best.
And I saw you nodding along there. Is there anything you'd want to add from your experience?
Well, I was going to say that I think successful collaboration is about mutual benefit. And that's, I think, a version of what Maria has just said. So, and also, of course, it depends on the research that you're doing. So It's great if you can travel to international conferences or talk to international visitors when they're in our own country. But even without that possibility to run into people face to face, I think if I ever received a letter or an email or a contact from somebody who wanted to talk to me about our research back when I was a researcher and was interested in how we could collaborate, that would always be an interesting thing to engage in. So it's a matter of identifying people who have something to offer you and thinking about what you might offer them, it seems to me. And then, of course, successful collaboration depends on friendship and mutual respect and treating people with trust and respect. So there are lots of elements to successful collaboration, but making that contact in the first place is really about identifying mutual benefit, in my view.
Great, thank you very much. So one of the other questions are there any plans for any speed of meeting, event or connection facilitation where interested European and Australasian scientists in similar subjects can meet each other across different levels to help build relationships that could lead to joint proposals? And I think in some ways, some of the responses to the earlier questions kind of have said that you know, you do have to be master of your own destiny a bit, but, you know, there are certainly things that happen if anyone's got any event or anything that they want to promote here. But I do know that it's challenging. You know, there are so many different relationships and different topic areas that could be facilitated. And so I think that, you know, being master of your own destiny, organising things yourself is actually, you know, a really powerful tool. Anyone want to jump in there? And I think, of course, Euraxess itself as a hub for this is an amazing vehicle, you know. So, Nishant, I don't know if you wanted to kind of jump in and spruik some stuff there. Off you go.
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Sarah, for that. And thank you for that question. I think there are a few ways in which you can look at it. I will, of course, mention about the Marie Curie brokerage platform that there is currently available till 2024, I believe, where you can actually meet potential hosts, supervisors, and you can also get involved. So this is where you can actually have some exchange. Of course, when we receive questions like these, when we're organizing the events like the ERD, if there is an interest, active interest, we will try to see if we can organize a brokerage event next year. But this is something that we always do as a demand-driven thing rather than determining ourselves on what we want to organize. So I think those are the two things that I wanted to mention. I will not take much time from you.
Thank you very much. So I know we're running close to the end of our time. So I thought I'd just ask for anyone have any final thoughts. I also think, you know, if there was one thing you could do to reduce barriers to international collaboration, to make it easier for people, what would it be? You know, would it be something that's come out of the pandemic? You know, greater data sharing, you know, mobility, you know, the use of multiple platforms to enable collaboration over you know, time and distance, as we've been able to see with Zoom and things, or something else. So, Brent, I know you've got a hand up for an earlier bit, so I'll let you start.
Thank you, Sarah. Look, I was just following up there with your question to Nishant, and it relates to that connection. So, and in particular, it relates to EMCRs in terms of we seem to have quite a focus on academic research, but I think the connection between, we need to establish that tripartite connection between the universities, research institutes, and industry. If we can do that, because the pathway for EMCRs may well not be solely in academia. It's that connection between research institutes and, in particular, industries. And I think there's a huge potential, especially in the latter with industries, of taking that research that is generated from within the universities, connected to the research institutes, into industry. That's a view that I think is quite important, especially for our young researchers.
Great, thanks so much. So, Robert, I might move on to you next.
If I was to take away one of the biggest changes, I think, or reminders, I think, from the current time, is you have so much more opportunity now to collaborate which means everyone is actually getting bombarded with a lot more information. So you have to be a lot more persistent now than you've ever been before in seeking engagements with others, because you've got to rise above the noise, background noise. So it's an important thing to not get discouraged if you're not responded to instantaneously, by industry, by any senior academic. That they will take time. They will generally respond. They'll just take a little time to get down there. So be persistent.
Great, thanks. That's an excellent thought to finish on. Thank you. Frances, your final thought.
I think the pandemic has a disproportionate effect on early and mid-career researchers as well as women in STEM, and I think we have to give them more opportunities to recover from that.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Anne, your final thought?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Looking back over some decades of being in the research world, it seems to me we live in a really extraordinary time of opportunity. The world is relatively small for us now. It's easy to get around, especially now that borders are open again for most countries. And we should take advantage of that where it's appropriate. But the digital means of communication mean that the world really is very small. And that means that geographical barriers really shouldn't be in the way now of us collaborating wherever we can. And then I think we layer on top of that that the best collaborators are built on strong personal relationships. And I think one of the most wonderful opportunities of the time we live in is the possibility to have scientific friendships all over the world. There's nothing is more fun, I think, than those sorts of global collaborations.
That's brilliant. And Maria, you come to you last for the final thought.
Well, I mean, everything's been said. So the one outcome is, of course, that it's completely normal for us here to sit together in a Zoom call. We've learned how to do that. We've learned what Zoom calls are good for. But like everyone else has said, we've also learned with that absence for 2 years what personal interactions are good for. And they really are important. And a lot more happens intellectually when you sit together in a room, and when there's silence, you don't just turn off your Zoom, but you stay together and talk. So I think that's something else we've learned, and that it turns out we value, and that's important for international scientific collaboration.
Full bandwidth conversation, as my former boss used to say. So I'd like to say thank you to all the panelists. I'd like to invite the people listening to give their thanks as well. And I really appreciate this really good conversation, and thanks to you all. And I'll hand back to Nishant.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. I think I might be a little bit biased in saying that, but this 1 hour has been one of the most excellent panel discussion I've heard too. So thank you very much, all of you, for taking out valuable time from your calendar and to speak to the research ecosystem in Australia and New Zealand, and especially joining so much early from Brussels. So a big thank you from our end. This brings us to the end of the first day of the European Research Days 2020, Australia and New Zealand. We have 4 more days to go. But with that, a sincere gratitude to our esteemed speakers for today for imparting their wisdom. I'm sure our attendees found it very insightful. With that, I think I'll sign off for today and see you again tomorrow at 6 p.m. Australia time, which is 8 p.m. New Zealand time, for day 2 of ERD, where we will focus on PhD and postdoc opportunities in the EU member state. Signing off for today, and thank you very much for joining in. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.